She was already at the gate, one child on her hip and two clinging to her skirts, when Elias Ward heard himself call out a word he had not planned to say. Wait. The wind carried it thin across the yard, and for a moment he thought she hadn't heard. Then Ruth Callahan turned. Slow, careful, the way a woman turns when she has learned that hope is a thing that costs you, and looked back at him. Elias Ward was 41 years old, and in all those years he had never once done a thing he couldn't explain to himself afterward. He could not explain this. He only knew that the sight of her walking away, 3 small children in tow and a carpet bag that held everything they owned, had put a stone in his chest he could not swallow down. He had not ordered this. That was the plain truth of it. 6 weeks earlier, sitting at his kitchen table by the light of a single lamp, Elias had written a letter to an agency in St. Louis. He had asked for a wife. A practical woman, the letter said. Someone strong enough for ranch work, sensible enough not to expect softness from a man who had forgotten how to give it. He had lost his own wife, Sarah, 4 years past. A quiet fever that took her in the night, peaceful at the end, her hand in his. He had buried her under the cottonwood and had not spoken her name aloud since. The ranch had grown lonesome in a way that ached in the bones. So he had written the letter, sealed it, and told himself it was a business arrangement and nothing more. The reply had come in a woman's careful hand. Ruth Callahan, 34 years old, widowed, willing to work, willing to come. She had not mentioned the children. Perhaps she had been afraid to. Perhaps she had thought that once she was standing in front of him, a man would find it harder to turn away 3 living souls than 3 lines on a page. If that was her gamble, she had gambled wrong. Because when the wagon had rolled into the yard that morning and Elias had seen the small faces peering out from behind her, a boy of 9, a girl of 6, a little one of 3 no bigger than a lamb, the first thing he had felt was not tenderness, it was betrayal. You didn't say, he had told her, standing stiff on his own porch. In your letter, you didn't say there were children. Ruth had lifted her chin. She was a tall woman, worn thin by hard years, with dark hair pulled back plain, and eyes the gray of a winter sky. No, she had said, I didn't. I asked for a wife. Not a... He had stopped himself, but the word had hung there anyway, ugly and unspoken. A family, a burden, 4 more mouths at a table that had gone quiet. I know what you asked for. Her voice had not shaken. And I know what I am. I'm a woman with 3 children, and no husband, and no place left to go. I thought if I told you plain, you'd say no before you ever met us. So I didn't tell you plain. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry for it. She had bent then, gathered the littlest one higher on her hip, and taken the boy by the hand. We'll not trouble you. The wagon can carry us back to the station. And she had walked toward the gate. That was when the stone came into his chest. That was when he heard himself say, wait. Now she stood turned toward him, the 3 children silent, as only frightened children can be silent, and Elias found he had no idea what he meant to say next. The boy, Samuel, she had called him, was watching him with a flat, guarded look, a boy already old enough to know when a man was about to hurt his mother. The little girl, Hannah, 6 years old, with her mother's gray eyes, had her face buried in Ruth's skirts. And the baby, Nell, 3 years old, was staring at Elias with the frank, unbothered curiosity of a child too young to have learned fear. It was Nell who broke it. She lifted one small hand, pointed past Elias to the dog, dozing on the porch, an old blue heeler named Scout, and said, clear as a bell, doggy. Something in Elias cracked. He had not heard a child's voice in this yard in his whole life. He and Sarah had wanted children, and had not been given them, and after she died, he had stopped letting himself want anything at all. And now here was this baby, pointing at his old dog, saying doggy, like it was the finest thing she had ever seen, and the loneliness he had carried for 4 years turned over in him like a stone rolling off a grave. Yes, he said. His voice came out rough. That's a doggy. His name's Scout. He's old and he's lazy, and he won't hurt you." Nell considered this with great seriousness. Then she looked up at her mother, and back at Elias, and asked the question that would decide everything. "We stay?" Ruth's arms tightened around her daughter. She did not look at Elias. She was too proud to beg. He could see that, and too tired to hope. And she stood there in the cold spring wind, waiting for a stranger to break her children's hearts. Elias Ward looked at the four of them standing at his gate, and he thought about the letter he had written, about the practical woman, and the sensible arrangement, and he understood all at once that he had been asking the world for a thing that did not exist. There was no such thing as a life without softness. There was only softness you let in, or softness you shut out, and called yourself strong for the shutting. "You stay," he said. The morning he made room for them, Elias Ward did not yet know it was the morning that would save his life. The first weeks were not easy, and Elias would have been a liar to say otherwise. He had lived alone so long that the sound of the house being full unsettled him. The children woke early and went to bed late, or so it seemed to a man used to silence. Samuel would not speak to him, not out of rudeness, but out of a watchfulness that Elias slowly came to understand. The boy had lost a father. He had watched his mother struggle, and now a strange man held the roof over their heads, and Samuel had decided, in the grim arithmetic of a 9-year-old, that his job was to protect them all from whatever this stranger might do. Ruth worked like she meant to earn every meal twice over. She was up before dawn, and the kitchen that had gone cold and joyless in Sarah's absence began to smell of bread again. She mended the fences of the vegetable garden that Elias had let go to ruin. She scrubbed floors that had not been scrubbed in years. She did all of it without complaint, and without warmth, a woman paying a debt, and it began to trouble Elias in a way he could not name. One evening in the 3rd week, he found her out by the woodpile after the children were abed, splitting kindling in the last gray light. "That's my work," he said. "You were mending the tack. Somebody had to do it." "Ruth." He said her name, and it stopped her, the axe resting on the block. "You don't have to work yourself to the bone to stay. I told you you could stay. I meant it." She was quiet a moment. Then, without turning, she said, "Where I come from, a woman who takes and doesn't give is called a burden. I won't be a burden. Not to you, not to anybody. I've been called worse things than tired." She set another log on the block. "It's the only way I know how to keep my children fed and my head up at the same time. So let me split the wood." He let her split the wood, but he stood there in the dark and watched her, and he thought that there was a kind of strength in the world that had nothing to do with size, and he had lived 41 years without ever once seeing it plain until now. The turning came slow, the way spring comes to the high country, not all at once, but in 100 small thaws. It came the afternoon Samuel fell from the loft ladder, and Elias caught him before he hit the ground, and the boy, breathless and startled, forgot to be guarded, and clung to him for one long moment before pulling away. It came the evening. Hannah brought him a drawing she had made on the back of a feed bill, a house, 4 stick figures, a dog, and a tall man off to the side, not quite part of the group, but close, closer than a stranger would stand. It came the night the little one, Nell, woke crying from a bad dream, and it was Elias who reached her first. Elias who lifted her from her bed and walked the floor with her against his shoulder until she quieted. And Ruth, who stood in the doorway, watching a man she had married out of desperation, hum a tune she did not know he remembered. They had married quietly by then. A plain ceremony in the church at Cedar Crossing, Montana Territory, the 2nd week after she came. It had been an arrangement on paper, but somewhere in those thawing weeks, it had stopped being only that, and neither of them had spoken of it, because to speak of it might break the fragile thing that was forming, like ice too thin to name. The blizzard came in the last week of April, when the country had let itself believe winter was done. It came down out of the north with no warning any of them could read, a wall of white that swallowed the mountains, and then the fences, and then the barn, until the world was nothing but wind and cold, and the small yellow eye of the lamp in the window. Elias had seen bad storms in his years on the ranch. He had not seen one like this in the spring, when the cattle were scattered and unready, and a man could lose everything he owned between one nightfall and the next. He pulled on his heaviest coat. "You can't go out in that," Ruth said. "The cattle are in the low pasture. If I don't bring them into the lee of the ridge, I'll lose the whole herd, and if I lose the herd, I lose the ranch. And then, where are any of us?" He wound a scarf around his face. "I'll follow the fence line. I know this land." She caught his arm at the door. For a moment they stood there, the wind screaming beyond the wood, and she looked at him with those winter-gray eyes, as though she were memorizing him. "Come back," she said. It was not a request. It was the closest thing to a claim she had ever laid on him. "These children have buried one father. Don't you dare make them bury another." "Father." She had said father. Elias Ward went out into the storm, carrying that word like a coal in his chest, and it kept him warm when nothing else could. He found the cattle by sound and by memory, drifting blind before the wind. He worked for hours he could not count, hazing them one by one along the fence toward the shelter of the ridge, his hands gone past feeling, ice building in his beard, the cold pressing on him like a hand that meant to push him down into the snow and hold him there. Twice he lost the fence line and had to stop, heart slamming, and grope through the white until his glove found the wire again. Twice he thought of Sarah under the cottonwood, and how easy it would be to lie down. And twice he thought of a little girl pointing at an old dog, saying doggy, of a boy who had learned to laugh again, of a woman splitting kindling in the dark so she would not be a burden, of the word father, laid on him like a hand on his shoulder. He did not lie down. It was near dawn when he came stumbling back into the yard, more dead than alive, and the door flew open before he reached it. Ruth had kept the lamp burning all night in the window. She had not slept. She got him inside and out of his frozen coat and down by the fire, and she chafed the life back into his hands with her own. And when he could finally speak, what he said was not about the cattle. "You waited up." "Of course I waited up." Her voice broke on it, the first time he had ever heard it break. "You fool man, you stubborn, good, foolish man. Did you think I'd sleep?" And Elias, who had not wept since he buried his wife 4 years past, felt his eyes sting hot and did not fight it. He turned his frozen hand in hers until their fingers laced together, and he held on. "I thought I was doing you a kindness," he said, "back at the gate, letting you stay. I thought I was the one giving something." He shook his head slowly. "It was the other way round the whole time. You saved me, Ruth, all 4 of you. You walked into my yard, and you saved a dead man's life, and you didn't even know you were doing it." She did not answer with words. She only tightened her grip on his hand, there by the fire, while beyond the window, the storm at last began to break, and a thin gray light came up over a ranch that had, against every odd, held. The cattle lived. Elias lost fewer than a dozen head, which in a storm like that was a small miracle. And the neighbors who came by in the days after, to check on the folks at the Ward place, shook their heads and said he'd been lucky. Elias did not tell them it had not been luck. He did not tell them about the word carried like a coal, or the lamp in the window, or the hands that had chafed him back to living. Some things a man keeps, but the ranch changed after that, and everyone who came by could feel it, even if they could not have said why. There was bread in the kitchen, and laundry on the line, and a boy learning to rope in the yard under a tall man's patient eye. There was a little girl who followed the old blue heeler everywhere, and called him my scout, as though she'd been born to him. There was a middle child, Hannah, who no longer drew the tall man off to the side of the family, but square in the middle of it, holding the smallest one's hand. And there was Ruth. Ruth who had come to that gate, braced for cruelty, and prepared to walk her children back into a hard and uncertain world, rather than beg. Ruth who had learned, slow and disbelieving, that the man who called her back had meant it, that the staying was real, that the father was real, that she had walked into a stranger's yard, carrying nothing but 3 children and a carpet bag, and had somehow, without meaning to, come home. One evening near summer, with the light long and gold across the pasture, Elias found her standing at the gate again. The same gate. She was not leaving. She was only leaning on it, watching the children chase the dog through the tall grass. And when he came to stand beside her, she did not startle. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "That morning, how close I came to walking through this gate the other way." Elias looked at the gate. It was only a gate. Weathered rails and a rope loop. Nothing to look at. And it was the most important place on the whole of his land, because a life had turned on it. "I nearly let you," he said quietly. "I nearly stood there like a stone, and let the four of you walk away, and told myself I was a sensible man for it." He shook his head. "I'd have died out here. Not that spring, maybe, but some winter, some fever, alone under a cottonwood, with nobody to keep the lamp lit. And I'd never have known what I missed, because you can't miss what you were too much of a coward to let yourself want." Ruth was quiet. Out in the grass, Nell shrieked with laughter as the old dog knocked her gently down and stood over her wagging. "What made you call me back?" she asked. "I've wanted to know, all this while. What made you say wait?" Elias thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "The baby said doggy," he told her. "That's all." She pointed at that lazy old dog, and she said doggy, like the world was brand new. "And I thought," his voice roughened, "I thought, a man who could shut the gate on that isn't a man I want to be. I'd spent 4 years being that man, being careful, being closed. And your littlest one said one word, and I was so tired of it, Ruth. So tired of being a stone." Ruth reached over and took his hand where it rested on the gate rail, the way she had that night by the fire, their fingers lacing together, weathered and sure. "You were never a stone," she said. "A stone doesn't call anybody back." They stood there together, as the sun went down over the mountains. An ordinary man and an ordinary woman, who had each been handed a hard life, and had made, out of the wreck of it, something neither had dared to ask for. The children played until the light was gone. The lamp came up warm in the window, and the gate that Ruth Callahan had once walked toward with her heart breaking stood open behind them, the way a gate should, not to keep the world out, but to let the right lives in. She had not been what he ordered. She had been, it turned out, the only thing he had ever truly needed.